Kayak gets my flight, hotel, and rental car right, so I can tune out travel advice that's just plain wrong.
Bro, Skycoin. Way better than points.
Never fly during a Scorpio full moon.
Just tell the manager you'll sue. Instant room upgrade.
Stop taking bad travel advice. Start comparing hundreds of sites with Kayak and get your trip right.
Bad advice? You talking to me?
Kayak. Got that right.
As the vast Kansas prairie swallowed many travelers without a trace, people assumed it was simply the natural risks of the frontier. Until suspicion turned toward one lonely homestead along the Osage Mission Trail. A place that held a secret far more terrifying than anyone could have suspected. This is true crime of the historical kind. You're listening to The Bloody Benders, Part 2, Hell's Half-Acre. If you missed Part 1, make sure to go back and listen there first. It was May of 1873 when Osage Township trustee Leroy Dick stepped onto the Benders' property and took in the scene. Livestock had been left unfed, some of the animals had already died from neglect. The yard was eerily quiet, and a foul odor was lingering in the air. There was a heavy, ominous feeling about the place, but even still, there was no way he could have imagined just how dark the truth would get. Leroy left the homestead to raise the alarm to nearby neighbors and local officials that the Benders had fled. Within days, a somber but determined search party assembled at the Bender homestead. Leroy Dick, Detective Beers, the York brothers, and dozens of other local men approached the one-room cabin. The cabin itself was known for being ill-kept even when occupied. Now, as they stepped inside, flies filled the dark corners, and the air was thick with that unpleasant smell that seemed to cling to everything. Many of the men had lived through the Civil War and knew the smell of death all too well. The concentration of it seemed to lead them to a straw mattress behind the curtain. They pushed the bed aside to find a hidden trapdoor in the floorboards. They pried it open and found the source. They were looking down into a small cellar. They all but expected to find a body there. The dirt was dark and sticky with layers of old blood that had soaked deep into the earth. But as far as they could tell, there was no body here. At least, not anymore. The men were determined to be thorough, so they lifted the entire small cabin off of its foundation so they could do a more thorough search beneath it. But still, there were no bodies in the cellar or under the house. So they turned their attention to outside of the cabin. As they examined the garden and orchard, they could tell that there were several patches of dirt that looked recently disturbed. They began probing the ground with long metal rods. It didn't take long for their fears to be confirmed. They found a shallow grave. As they pushed the dirt aside, they uncovered a man's body, laying face down. His skull had been shattered by what must have been a powerful hammer blow from behind, and his throat was slashed. The same pattern that the dead men on the trail had. Ed York looked upon the body and knew immediately. This was his brother, Dr. William Henry York. Dr. York had been buried so hastily that his feet were barely covered. The next day, the search continued. It seemed surreal or even unbelievable, but they began to find shallow grave after shallow grave on the property. They found W.F. McCrotty of Cedarvale, then Ben Brown from the same area. Next came Henry Mackenzie of Hamilton County, Indiana. Some victims had been killed months earlier and were badly decomposed. Others appeared more recent. Then they came upon a grave of a man and a small child, buried together. This was George Newton Loncourt and his 18-month-old daughter, Mary Ann. The little girl was the only victim who did not show clear signs of a hammer or knife wound. The absence of those marks led some of the men to believe that she might have been suffocated or even buried alive. The heavy realization was settling over the group. It wasn't just that people had been murdered here, but that a defenseless child had likely met her end in a way too cruel for many of them to fully put into words. These were men who had seen battle, lived through a brutal war, and they were turning away from the grave, some swearing under their breath or others fighting back nausea. Anger began to simmer along with the shock. Naturally, there was anger at the Benders, but also at the thought of unsuspecting travelers being lured here and butchered without anyone knowing. It violated everything they believed was right. There was something almost sacred about offering shelter. To turn that hospitality into a trap, to prey on a guest's vulnerability, felt like a rejection of basic humanity, a tearing of the very threads all of their survival depended on.
No one goes to Hank's for his spreadsheets. They go for a darn good pizza. Lately, though, the shop's been quiet, so Hank decides to bring back the $1 slice. He asks Copilot in Microsoft Excel to look at his sales and costs and help him see if he can afford it. Copilot shows Hank where the money's going and which little extras make the dollar slice work. Now Hank has a line out the door. Hank makes the pizza, Copilot handles the spreadsheets. Learn more at m365copilot.com/work.
The search continued. They examined a well and found that a man had been thrown down it. They were also finding scattered bones, pieces of clothing, personal items, and dismembered body parts that showed there were probably many more victims. But in total, they recovered at least 8 bodies on the property. The Benders' homestead was huge, with 160 acres. They had to accept that this section of the property that would soon be known as Hell's Half-Acre was probably all they could realistically search. As locals were finding out about the horrific discoveries, they were filled with disgust, then fury. How could this quiet little homestead on the prairie be a human slaughterhouse? The fear was becoming overwhelming as people imagined how many travelers had actually stopped at the Bender place for a meal or a night's rest and never left. The onlookers were getting angrier and angrier. It was difficult for them to comprehend if this extreme level of cruelty could be done by the Bender family alone. It was hard enough for them to believe that the Bender women may be involved. As they processed what they were hearing about the homestead, the mood turned ugly. Some started to say that this had to be some broader network of criminal activity, that there had to be more people in on it. At the same time, all the people's negative impressions of the Benders seemed to swell, and what had once been oddities were now seen as clues to their evil. People wanted to distance themselves from the Benders and sort the crowd into good and bad. For them, a way to do that was to turn their rage on a person that they felt was aligned with the Benders. Among the onlookers was a German immigrant named Rudolf Brockmann. He was a neighbor who had been friendly with the Benders and had even briefly partnered with Pa Bender on some business dealings. It was as if with the Benders gone, someone else would have to answer for what had happened here. Because Brockmann spoke with a heavy German accent and had been associated with the family, they seized on him as the next best target. They started by questioning him, asking him where the Benders were and what did he have to do with it. They pressed him for information, but Brockmann denied knowing or being a part of anything. The anger and fear in the crowd turned them into a hateful mob. They put a rope around Brockmann and hoisted him into the air. There are different accounts of whether they tied a noose around his neck or his thumb, but either way, the pain was excruciating. When Brockmann was close to losing consciousness, they would lower him, shout more questions, and demand that he admit he had helped or at least knew something about the Benders. When he insisted that he knew nothing, they would hang him again. The torture was repeated several times until they finally let him go. Brockmann stumbled away half senseless and was later arrested, though it was only briefly. Many people were also arrested in a desperate attempt for answers. Basically, anyone who was suspected of selling stolen goods or having some knowledge of the murders, but none of them were ever charged with the killings themselves. Meanwhile, the search party formed into a full posse. They set off in every direction, determined to catch the killer family. Newspapers wasted no time spreading headlines across the country that read, "The Bender Murders, a Den of Assassins," and "The Prairie Butcher Shop." One Kansas paper wrote, "No person can describe the horribleness of the bloody deeds." And of course, this is where people started to call the Bender property Hell's Half-Acre. But that didn't stop people from wanting to see it for themselves. In the days that followed, more than 3,000 people descended on the homestead. Special trains ran from Independence and Coffeyville just to bring people closer to the remote homestead. Passengers still had to walk miles across the prairie to see the sight of horrors and stare into the empty graves. The air still carried the stench of death as women held handkerchiefs to their noses and photographers set up their cameras. Images from the site would later appear in Harper's Weekly. The murder tourists began tearing the cabin apart to take pieces of souvenirs. They collected boards, nails, anything they could carry to keep or to sell. The Benders were all anyone could talk about. Theories went wild and everyone had an opinion. As horrified as people were, they couldn't help but feel some level of excitement in being somehow in the know or connected to the story that was becoming bigger by the day. Ideas of this being a grand conspiracy or a network of criminals began to mostly fall away. All the talk did help because the people of Labette County were able to put together a pattern. It would appear as though guests who came to the Bender cabin for a stay were encouraged to sit at the table in the chair nearest the curtain. Most likely, Kate, who was well practiced because of her spiritualism work, would hold the visitors' attention. Then, one family member, probably Pa or John Jr., would sneak behind the curtain and deliver a crushing hammer blow to the back of the head, while another rushed in to slit the victim's throat to ensure they were dead. The body was then quickly dropped through the trapdoor to hide. There, they would be stripped of valuables and later buried in the garden or orchard under the cover of darkness. Then they'd simply go about their routine. They'd bury identifiable belongings, but if anyone asked about some goods, they'd simply say it's what they received as payment before the traveler carried on their way. It doesn't quite add up. The victims never had much money on them. Could that really be a big enough motive for killing on this grand of a scale? So what were the Benders really after? Naturally, the more clarity about the Benders' crimes made their capture all that more imperative, and authorities were hot on their trail. Finally, they found a clue. The Benders' wagon was found abandoned just outside the small town of Thayer, about 12 miles north of the homestead, with a starving team of horses still hitched to it. As authorities asked locals about what they may have seen, they were able to learn that the Benders had bought train tickets for Humboldt on the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad. From there, it appeared that the family had split, surely to make them less conspicuous. Gebhardt and Kate reportedly disembarked and headed for the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad line, heading south toward Red River County near Denison, Texas. This was an area known as a rough outlaw colony where lawmen rarely ventured, and if they did, rarely returned. Pa and Ma Bender were believed to have continued north towards Kansas City and possibly on to St. Louis. The newspapers continued to report on every detail they could. As the public interest soared, there were endless reports of sightings and stories emerging. So many, it was impossible for authorities to verify what was genuine, what was rumor, or what was a hoax. So, despite the wave of information coming in, none of it was actually helpful, and the trail essentially went cold. The hunt for the Benders felt as though they were always just beyond reach. The same ambiguity, lack of organized law enforcement, and expanse of the frontier that the Benders used to hide their crimes for 2 years was the same way they were able to seemingly disappear. But that didn't mean they were forgotten. Rumors about the Benders continued to swirl for years. Some said the entire family had been hunted down and killed by vigilantes, with their bodies being thrown into a river or buried somewhere on some unidentifiable stretch of land. Others claimed that Kate and John Gephardt successfully disappeared into outlaw country. One detective later insisted he had tracked Gephardt only to learn the young man had died of apoplexy. Still, others said they were living under new aliases right under some unsuspecting town's noses. Which really wouldn't be that hard to do, considering the Bender name itself may have been an alias, and no one ever knew for certain who they truly were to begin with. Time began to pass, and as it did, the little patch of land that had once drawn thousands of gawkers slowly returned to being just another piece of Kansas prairie. Over the years, as new families arrived and the frontier transformed into more settled farm communities, the events turned into ghost stories, then legend. Parents used the story as a warning to children about trusting strangers, and old-timers pointed out the trail as where those murders were. Newspaper columns would occasionally resurrect the case when another body turned up somewhere in the region or when someone claimed to have seen a Bender under a new name. Each time, hope flickered that there may finally be justice. But nothing substantial happened for 16 years. Then, it seemed as though half of the Benders had suddenly re-emerged. In the fall of 1889 in Niles, Michigan, 2 women were arrested for larceny. A mother and daughter were accused of stealing a frying pan, some pewter plates, and a pair of infant stockings. Their names were Elmira Monroe, also known as Elmira Griffith, or Elvira Hill, and her daughter Sarah Eliza Davis. The criminal mother-daughter duo seemed to fit perfectly with the profiles of Ma and Kate Bender. Leroy Dick, who was now deputy sheriff, traveled to Michigan along with one of the victims' family members. They knew they were the women they had been searching for 16 years. After identifying the pair, the women were rearrested on suspicion of the murders and extradited to Oswego, Kansas. And the national excitement came roaring back to life. Crowds gathered in Oswego, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous mother and daughter. The preliminary hearing became one of the strangest identification proceedings in Kansas history. A packed courtroom heard testimony from 16 witnesses brought in from Labette County and the surrounding area. But the results were quite literally divided. 7 witnesses were certain that these were the Bender women and pointed directly at them, declaring that there is old lady Bender and that is Kate. 7 others were equally positive that they were not the Bender women. The remaining 2 were unsure. It got stranger when the 2 women turned on each other during the proceedings. Sarah Eliza Davis signed an affidavit claiming that Elvira was indeed Ma Bender, which you may think would implicate her as Kate. But no, she insisted that Elvira was Ma, but she was not Kate. She was supposedly another daughter. Witnesses began to take the stand. One man known locally as Happy Jack Reed testified that he had once stayed the night at the Bender cabin. He remembered the evening as ordinary enough, at least at first. He and Kate were talking easily for a time, then sensing she was upset while the others hovered in the background, he decided to go to sleep. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, he was jolted awake by a heavy, dull thud, like something solid had struck the floor or a wall. He laid there in stillness, telling himself it was just the house settling in the wind. Then came another sound, like a wet, choking sort of gurgle that rose and stopped suddenly. His instinct was to freeze. He held his breath, was listening for anything else, his heart was pounding, and he stared into the dark, but couldn't bring himself to move or call out. After that, there was only silence. In the morning, when daylight finally filtered in, the Bender family moved about as if nothing had happened. Kate was cheerful. Pa and Ma were their usual grim selves, and no one mentioned any commotion in the night. Jack said that he ate a few hurried bites of breakfast, all while replaying those noises in his mind. Internally, he was questioning himself if that was a dream or if he had imagined it, but he couldn't shake the sense of unease that he felt. So he gathered his things as quickly as he could and left. Another woman described how she had once gone to the Bender cabin for a spiritual meeting with Kate, hoping for comfort and a message from her late husband. At first she tried to ignore her discomfort, But as the seance went on, Kate's tone turned darker. When she opened her eyes, the entire Bender family were suddenly there, staring at her blankly. Terrified, she bolted from the cabin and ran as fast as she could, convinced that the family meant to kill her. The accounts were compelling, but after so much time and so much narrative about the Benders, it was difficult to tell what were reliable accounts and what had developed as legend after the fact. The strongest evidence in the case seemed to point to their innocence. From what they could gather, it looked as though the women were in Michigan at the time of the murders, possibly that Elvira had been in jail at the time. The judge concluded he was not able to positively identify these women as Ma and Kate Bender, so the case collapsed. The judge discharged them both and they walked free. For the victims' families, it was just more disappointment and frustration that no one would ever be held accountable for these devastating crimes. In the decades after the murders, the Benders' place passed quietly from one private owner to another. By the early 1900s, the land had been folded into ordinary farming. It was plowed, fenced, and grazed like any other parcel in Labette County. Some residents embraced the notoriety as a grim claim to fame. Others were embarrassed that their county was still associated with a murder farm. There were occasional proposals for roadside markers, but because the ground remained in private hands, the site was just another quiet stretch of rolling prairie used for crops and pasture. In 2020, the property was acquired by a new owner, and beginning in 2023, he partnered with the University of Kansas for archaeological field studies. Students and researchers continue to carefully excavate the area, hoping to locate any remaining artifacts from the 1870s. They've actually found hundreds of items, but nothing to help explain the actions of the Bender family. In the last 150 years, the story of the Bloody Benders has inspired horror movies, books, and ghost stories. There's even inspiration of the Benders found in the video game Red Dead Redemption 2. The story clearly continues to fascinate people. And with the development of psychological profiling, today we consider the repetitive and intentional nature of the Benders' killings to be similar to what we'd expect to see from serial killers. In retrospect, it's believed the Benders probably had 10 to 11 victims, though they may have killed as many as 20 unsuspecting souls. With so many unanswered questions, all we can really do now is look back through a modern understanding of violence and human behavior across history's unique circumstances and possible motives. So, were the Bloody Benders nothing more than ruthless thieves exploiting the vulnerabilities of the frontier for what little money they could find? Or were they America's first true family of serial killers? Maybe both? This was True Crime of the Historical Kind. Thank you so much for listening. I am excited to release a few sideshow bonus episodes that will be out soon. So look out for those. Make sure that you're following so you don't miss it. But as always, just happy that you're here. I can't wait to share the next story with you. Until next time, bye.